Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us on this next session of the CEO Leaders Summit. And I am very pleased to have one of those CEOs that we've been excited to interview, Stephen Wilson of INCA. Good morning to you, Stephen.
Good morning, Fraser.
Thank you for joining us. INCA is a great story, and we'll get into the depths of that story in a moment. Stephen, just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you, perhaps a little bit about your background, so that the audience can understand, the direction you come from, and so they can understand who you are.
Right. So I've been at Inkjet 20 years, which is a reasonable amount of time. Way back in '98, a guy called Bill Baxter introduced me to an internal project at Cambridge Consultants. We were making a small machine to demonstrate inkjet technology. We worked with Czar in those days. And this was to simulate digital print for packaging. So the idea was we were going to develop digital packaging printers with inkjet technology, and then use that as a means to kind of grow our business. At that time, I didn't realize that Bill wanted to do a startup. So a couple of years later, when he came up with the idea of INCA, I was very pleased to be part of that team. And we set up in May 2000, just at the time of Drupa. And we've had an interesting ride through those years. So we spent a lot of time in graphics, but we've come back to packaging now, and we're very pleased to kind of develop our skills in that direction and make use of the latest technology.
And we're going to talk a little bit about that, aren't we? That journey, that path from graphics to packaging, because actually, it resonates particularly with myself. When I was started at FESPA back in 2003, we were right at the beginning there of that sort of curve of digital technology coming into the wide format space. And particularly in retail and POP and POS. So you're going to tell us a little bit more about that and actually explain how you see that reflected in what's going to happen with packaging. So we'll get to that in a moment. Just give us a little bit of clarity in terms of where INCA's business are right now, and obviously, that sort of the bounce back effect from COVID. Where are you now?
So I think we are bouncing back from COVID. Obviously, retail graphics is a mature market, but digital is still gaining share over analog. We've seen our customers' print volumes rising 10% for several years. Obviously, COVID has knocked this back in the last year, but it has recovered already back to kind of monthly levels in 2019.
That's good, isn't it?
Yeah, we expect graphics to kind of get back to where it was and continue growing from next year.
No, that's really good, isn't it? That's really good. And you're obviously doing quite a lot of work in the single pass side of things. So tell us a bit about that.
Right. So we started our single pass journey for perhaps the second time back in 2012. So at the end of Drupa, we were talking to Fujifilm Dymatics about their Samba print heads. And we were one of the first companies to take those heads and start turning them into a machine. So back 20 years ago, we actually started INCA to do digitally print packaging, as I was explaining. We moved into graphics. We've done a lot of work there. We got some very successful products. So in the last 7 years since we got those Samba print heads, we've been developing machine, originally an internal project called Jetliner. You might have seen the video of that. That's 1.6 meter wide roll to roll. And then we partnered with BHS, and BHS wanted something similar, but faster and bigger. So now we've developed the RSR print engine for them. And that's 2.8 meters wide, and it's 300 meters per minute. So we think that's one of the most impressive single pass inkjet machines out there.
Definitely. And I guess you've learned quite a bit. We just talked at the beginning of the conversation about this evolution of the technology from the sort of wide format place to what will be packaging and development of the packaging world. You were very much part of that, the start of that. INCA as an organization, your machines were often saw them in big POP environments, so they were there, weren't they? What's that about? What that digital print revolution? What was that all about?
Well, we learned a lot about the fact it's not just the printer that needs to change. So if you look at things like variable data, the retail graphics industry wanted variable data, and we delivered it. It took a long while for the industry to make use of that. These days, it's not too hard to print every image different, and the rips are fast enough. But customers also need to change. They need to learn how to design varying images. They need to get good source data and learn how to use the fancy tools. So there's a lot more to making use of digital than just buying a printer. You've got to learn how to, do all that other stuff around it, the whole supply chain, pre-press, and getting organized for finishing as well. So if you can print every image different, then you want to cut it different as well. And that's a lot harder, as many people have discussed. So cutting, creasing, folding, those things aren't really digital yet. They're starting to be, but it's going to take a few years.
Yeah, sure. And obviously, we know that digital is great for personalization. We can sense that e-commerce is going to become increasingly important on the packaging side. These things are all important factors, aren't they? And things that this has occurred through that curve of development of wide format technology. It's going to probably happen in the same way with packaging, isn't it?
Yeah, I think a lot of the same things are going to imply over time. So I think if you look at e-commerce, for instance, personalized fulfillment is easy for the likes of Amazon, but it's quite hard for other big companies. And that's where you add a lot more value, because if you can ship directly to the customer, then you're personalizing it for that individual consumer, not just adding a name on a Coke bottle on the shelf like all the other Coke bottles.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting actually, because you're not the first person to say that you sort of feel there's more of a digital printing, digital packaging revolution around the corner. We know that there's a challenge with getting converters to get it. How do you work with the converters? How do you look at other customer bases? What do you do to kind of help this packaging revolution take place?
We are working with converters. We're getting out a lot to visit many converters in the industry. Our first homegrown product, so we got the BHS machine I talked about.
Yeah.
The next product we're going to launch through the screen channel is codenamed Speedset. And that's a sheet fed machine. The first version of that Speedset family will be B1 sheet size, which is, of course, ideally suited to folding carton. So we're talking to packaging converters in the folding carton industry. We're trying to understand their needs. And I think we're also going to talk to other people. So if you look at converters, if they digitally print a box or a flat sheet to make a box from, that has the same value whether it's analog or digital. So you end up in the old arguments about, oh, digital's just for short runs. But if you print much closer to the consumer, so imagine you're printing a box that you're going to post directly to that consumer, that adds a lot more value than just printing it in this normal box plant. So it's not just about converters. I think if you get close to the packing line, you're adding more value. And that's something we're going to explore with Speedset.
Yeah, I know, because obviously I've done some work with you guys. The idea of the box, and printing on the outside of the box, but also printing on the inside of the box, this kind of, it adds value, doesn't it?
Yes. And I think particularly with e-commerce, you're more likely to print on the inside of the box. So you have these sort of back to front boxes where it's white on the inside, and that's where you do the printing. On the outside, you might print, but you're just going to print name and address, this way up, basic stuff.
Yeah, basic
so
stuff.
It's a different way of looking at things, and it's a new requirement. Of course, COVID's brought that out of nowhere, really, because e-commerce was always there, but it's grown so much in the last year that it's a really interesting market that we want to learn more about.
Just stepping back a bit and thinking, we're pleased to have you with us as CEO of INCA. So you must have a bit of a vision strategically of taking this business forward. What are you thinking? What are you planning? What have you, what sort of resources and investment are you putting behind that move forward?
So we've obviously got the project with BHS, which has been going about 5 years now. We've got a dedicated team for that project. And that first machine will be announced very shortly. It's at a customer. It's going to be running in production very shortly. First commercial goal. But that's for BHS to talk about very shortly.
Yeah, sure.
Also, the Speedset project, that's been going for a few years as well. That'll be going through Screen's channel, as I said. So that's also got a dedicated team, and we're growing that team hugely at the moment, because we're moving from the technology phase through to the final product development. So we're putting an awful lot of money behind this.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a big commitment, isn't it?
We've got investment from BHS themselves, and we've also got investment from our parent company, Screen.
Oh, that's good. Okay, so that helps us to get a vision of your strategic thinking. Okay, so
and we have about a quarter or so of our employees dedicated to R&D as well. So
yeah, just out of curiosity, how many people have you got working for INCA? How large is the organisation?
Globally, it's a couple of hundred. So we've got a bunch of people, obviously, mostly in the UK, including a local support team. So we do direct support in the UK and Benelux. And then in the USA, we've got another team out there who support our American customers.
So just going back to that sort of the customer base, as you just alluded to there, what do you think customers who are thinking about this should be looking for with an Inkjet partner, with a partner, that's focused on packaging using Inkjet? What should they be looking for?
I think we've got to think beyond just the price of the machine. We've got to think more about the total cost of ownership. Mm-hmm. So when you buy a printer, the salesman will always talk about the equipment and the consumables. And to be honest, they've always done a bit of a trade-off there. So if you want a really good ink price, you might pay more for your machine, or vice versa. That's sort of in the swing of things. When you look at the total cost of ownership, that's a much more interesting question here, because you've got to look at the annual costs, the total annual TCO of running your press, and then divide it by the output. If you're looking at packaging, that's going to be a 7-figure in costs and an 8-figure in terms of the numbers of square meters, square feet you're producing. So you've got to include the equipment, consumables, labor, energy. And there's also indirect costs of finishing and fulfillment. Is digital saving you money there? How does the rest of your business change when you go digital? And of course, then there's hidden costs like SKU costs. So in the converter plant, you might not be aware of all these other costs from analog print, like storage and having to waste print quite often, because not only do you have yield that's often below the kind of target 90%, but also if you have a new marketing campaign, maybe you have to chuck your old boxes, and that's the cost.
So you got value, you got productivity, and productivity speed, or is it not just about speed?
Everybody talks about speed because it's very easy to compare, different printers, and this one's faster than that one. And obviously, we have a very fast machine with Speedset, so it's 150 meters a minute. That's certainly about the fastest sheet fed machine out there at the moment. But then you've also got to look at quality. You've got to say, well, if you've got a range of different print modes, then which mode can you use? Can you always use the fastest mode for every customer? Well, reality is possibly not. But then you've got that mode for your kind of easier jobs. And then if you want to charge more money, if you're going to print with higher quality for a premium customer, maybe you use a different mode that's better in the quality and lower in the speed. So you've got to understand which modes you need for those different customers and for those different jobs, and how that affects your overall productivity. So it's all about sort of understanding the equipment you've got and then matching the strengths of that equipment to your different customer needs.
Going back sort of 20 odd years to the sort of advent of digital print in the wide format market, there was a lot of people were saying things like, particularly if you're a screen printer, there were a lot of people saying screen print will never die, it's always going to be there, it's particularly in wide format, digital will never replace, it will never replace. So what can we learn in packaging using sort of inkjet?
I think we can learn a lot. So there's you just talking about it, it reminded me of the early days of INCA, and we our business plan 20 years ago said something like, there's hundreds of screen printers out there, and they all want to buy our machine, but even if we only get half of those people, we're still going to sell this many machines. And of course, we were very successful. Obviously, we did sell hundreds of machines, but what actually happened was that some of those customers understood digital. Maybe they had a slow digital machine in the corner, so they'd learned how to use a RIP, they learned how to do color management, and those guys were the early adopters, right? So just at the start of that adoption curve, and they went on to greater things because they got in early with industrial inkjet. They moved from kind of the slow CAD plotters to the machines we were making and selling 20 years ago. And then they went on with us. They went on with the growth curve. And many of our customers have bought each successive product we've launched over that time period. And as their business has grown and as the proportion of digital has grown within their business. So I think one thing you can learn from this is that if you go digital sooner, if you jump on that bandwagon, but learn about it, it's not just buying the equipment, it's also learning how to use it, learning how to get the best out of it, learning its strengths, then you can grab a share of this growing market.
Yeah.
And then later on, you're going to be the winner.
Yeah, I just wonder whether the marketplaces are slightly different, because if we go back to that time, let's say 2005, and I just remember machinery being launched, wide format digital print machinery being launched literally every year. There was 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 big manufacturers launching new technology. And the market was going crazy. The POP wide format market was going crazy for the sort of, faster, quicker, bigger, all that kind of stuff. It just feels a little bit different with digital packaging, particularly. There are not so many major manufacturers. The ones that are out there are kind of taking more time and more research to get it right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's slightly different, isn't it, Stephen? Just slightly different world.
I think there are technical challenges and there are commercial challenges, right? So technically, packaging is harder, right? So it's harder for a couple of reasons. One, speed. They have to have speed. So that's why it's sort of single pass or nothing, really. You can do sample packaging. You can do like a small run of stuff to just put in a shop and see how customers react. But if you want to do production packaging, you've got to have single pass printing. That's the first thing. Yeah. The ink technology is also very different. So UV ink is okay for some packaging, but if you're going to print food packaging with UV, then you need to have a good barrier. So sheet metal packaging is okay with UV ink because sheet metal is a very good barrier. And if you're doing secondary packaging like shelf ready or retail ready packaging, then obviously you've got a barrier like the tin of beans that's in the box, or the bag, that's a second barrier anyway. So UV is okay for that kind of application. But if you think about things like pizza boxes, well, right, there's nothing between the pizza and the box, right? So that's where you're kind of, you're going to have to need aqueous inks, because aqueous is the only way to get that kind of food safety for indirect food packaging. So that's why the Speedset is a single pass aqueous machine, whereas previously for posters, we've done mostly multi-pass UV machines. So there's a different technical requirement there for packaging on two sides. And then commercially, well, they're very different customers. Within graphics world, they're mostly owner-managed businesses. So there's one guy who's, or a family that owns a business, and they'll have, probably less than 100 employees, smaller than Inkjet typically, and they'll turn over a few million a year. So that printer is a big investment. But basically, if you convince the owner and the key directors of that company, they're happy to take the risk. They're happy to make the investment. They can do that. And that's what led to INCA's growth, because we came out of nowhere. We built a brand from nothing 20 years ago. And that's because those owner managers were prepared to take a bet on us. So with packaging, it's quite different, because there's a lot of big companies, as you said, and even the smaller companies, pretty sizable, very mature. They've been doing the same kind of thing with the same equipment for many years. So they're not used to this rate of change. So in some ways, yes, it's very similar to screen printing and retail graphics 20 years ago, because the digital adoption is still very low. On the other hand, you're dealing with much more big companies, and those corporate type companies, they have procurement committees, right? So it's not just about the one guy who owns a business, it's about a whole bunch of people who want different things. So you've got people in charge of quality, people in charge of operations, people just in charge of the procurement side, and you have to convince them all. So it's much more about having a very good business proposition that appeals to everybody, all the stakeholders in your customer's business.
Yeah, I think that's really valid what you've said. Although there's a comparison between digital into retail and digital, the marketplaces are quite different, aren't they? They are. the cost of the machine, the investment, the decision-making process, all those things. You were talking with sort of owners of 2, 3, 4 million euro businesses that were able to make decisions on buying a piece of new kit. Very different with the packaging world, very different with
very different.
And their relationships are also often different with their customers, with their brands.
Yeah, to be fair, some of those customers we already know, because for instance, a lot of the big corrugated companies will have a division which does corrugated display. So a lot of those already own onsets. So they still go through the same procurement process even to buy an onset, because they're a big company, because that's how they work. But I think we're used to that. That's sort of where we came from in a strange way, because at least when we came back to the starting founders of INCA, we came from Cambridge Consultants. We're used to selling to big corporate customers, and we kind of adapted to work with the needs of the retail graphics market. And now we're coming back more to sort of the corporate sale. So we recognize that those big corporate customers, uptime is really important. Because in the corrugated world, for instance, they're folding carton as well, they're used to uptimes of more than 90%, right? So they're not going to tolerate a machine that isn't as reliable as their existing analog machines. So that's really important to achieve. And I think we've got to understand that these customers will need, they will need to have very good equivalence with what they currently do. So in the converting world, at least, they need the reliability, they need serviceability, they need that dependability, not just performance, So it's not just performance and price, it's a whole package of things.
Yeah. Now, as we said before, that obviously it's a shame that Drupa is not taking place, or didn't take place last year. The landscape for the print industry and also some of the major packaging shows are not taking place. So those kind of environments where you would have been as the CEO of INCA talking to customers perhaps are not there at the moment. And you mentioned yourself, and I know you have been very active using other methods to go to market, other methods to show people. So you've done a lot of video. You've still been, your factory in Cambridge, you're still showing machinery in action. I just wonder what, if you had been at Drupa, let's say, it had been taking place and you'd been standing in front of the media, standing in front of the marketplace, and someone had said, so Stephen, where do you think the market's going? We've had COVID, it's the most dramatic situation for many years. What would be your kind of big vision, and how would you bring that market with you?
So there's two different markets, right, we're in. So there's the retail graphics and the packaging have quite different experiences, I think, during the pandemic. So retail graphics will also be, when shops have closed, there've been less need for posters. So the traditional retail graphics world had a really hard time, about a year ago, basically, April, May, June. It really dropped for a few months. It's come back over the last few months. So over the whole of the calendar year 2020, something like 15% down in terms of print volumes. Interestingly, in North America, in the USA, it's about half that, sort of more like 7 or 8%. So they've survived the pandemic in business terms better than UK and Europe have. And you can see that the monthly output, I'm trying to think, around the time of Thanksgiving and Christmas, there's that sort of November through to December sort of peak. You see that in every year in our graphics output. That was only a few percent down from the previous year. So actually, you can see that by the end of the year, the industry had kind of recovered a lot of its position there, and it helped that the shops are open in the UK, of course. In the packaging world, I think they've seen a lot of change as well. So clearly, if there's fewer shops open, then people aren't buying in shops, but they're buying online instead. So I think, because if a restaurant's not open, what do? You cook for yourself, right? So you're not buying more stuff in packaging, and therefore I think they've seen demand rise, at least in certain areas like food. You can see from the food supermarkets results. Last year were really good because people are buying stuff rather than going out to dinner.
Being in their house rather than going out to eat. So that part of the market's being strong.
That's helped food packaging. Obviously, the display side of corrugated is more like retail, so that suffered with the retail. Also, e-commerce has gone huge straight. So it's still a tiny market. It's a bit like where retail was in the 20 years ago. So it's a few percent, but it could come. I think it's going to carry on growing over the next few years, and that's something to look out for because it's still evolving. So what they want in 5 years' time might be quite different to what they have at the moment.
Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is there's been some changes that have occurred throughout the pandemic. There are some things that probably were going to happen anyway. We kind of know about. There are definitely, some interesting areas of growth. The economist that we had, we've got involved in the summit, he talks about a sort of boom period for the next 18 months or so. Do you see the same sort of thing?
Yeah, I can see an awful lot of investment coming back. So we've seen this before, right? So Inca's been through 2 recessions before this one. So 2001, the old dot-com bust. We just shipped our first few machines early 2001 before 9/11, before that recession. So we saw, a bit of a drought there, but we also saw that the rate picked up afterwards. So there was an extent to which people delay their decisions. So things like equipment investments, which is obviously what we're most interested in, those decisions don't get cancelled. They just get delayed because the business case hasn't gone away. It's just a question of the financing and the timing is affected by the recession. We saw the same thing during the credit crisis, 07 through 08. And then by the time we got to 2009, suddenly, there's a big peak of sales because people are just sat on their money for a whole year. And they still need to invest. They still have a good business case for the investment, so it will come back. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I think it will be great for our existing customers and also our future customers.
So pretty optimistic about the what's going to happen. As we come to the end of a kind of conversation, I just wonder whether there's anything you wanted to say to the audience in terms of the customer base. In terms of maybe how you are addressing your customers. Is there anything you wanted to add?
Well, just to say we're here. We're very keen to talk to everybody. Obviously, we know our existing customers pretty well, especially where we directly support them. And we want to have a conversation because, especially with our packaging machines, so for the Speedset product, so we decided it's going to be a B1 format, this first machine, but there's a lot of flexibility still in how we're going to develop that machine. And we're trying to make it a very adaptable platform. So it can print from thin stuff to thick stuff, different types of coating on the top sheet. We need to talk to people and hear their views because now is the time to influence that product. So we need to understand which other systems they want to integrate it with in terms of workflow and sheet handling. We need to understand what materials they want to print. So we're open to ideas, really. And this is the customer's opportunity to influence a product. So it's not like, some of our competitors will do some market research, go away and then go, ta-da, here it is. Whereas what we're trying to do is to say, right, well, we want to be in a conversation all the way through the development so that, we're small enough to be flexible, but we're big enough to be world class. And I think that's what makes INCA different, right? We can adapt to our customers' needs because we're relatively modest in size and agile in attitude.
That's a brilliant and absolutely perfect way of ending this conversation. It really helps us to get an understanding of where you sit in terms of your vision and your thinking. And as you just said, if anyone's thinking about this, they should be in touch because at least you're at that development phase where you can tweak things to suit a particular need. So Stephen, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciated that, and look forward to catching up with you again.
Really appreciate it.